guys. Welcome to episode 9 of the Magnus Archives review. This is probably one of the best story episodes that I think I have ever reviewed. It's not my personal favorite, but I love the story and I love everything about it. And let's just kind of get into it. It's called Father's Love. They don't ever give a specific date for this episode, but it starts off, I believe, in around the 1900s, not early hundreds, like late hundreds as well. And our specific victim is Julia Montarch, and she talks about her father, Robert Montarch, who is a serial killer in this episode. I love serial killers, so learning about them is very interesting. But we start off with her telling us a little bit that Robert Montarch actually ended up dying in prison. She goes into more detail a little bit later in the episode. And then she also talks about how the house and the shed in which all the killings happened, which was in their house, she just cannot let go of. And she is planning to let go of these after she gives her statement. Julia goes in to tell us that she actually didn't learn about her father being a serial killer until it came out in the tabloids. And that's kind of when she started to learn about everything. She says that this dated back to the night that her mother disappeared. Now, her mother actually vanished when Julia was 7 years old. Earlier that day, her and her mom had literally went to go see The Witches together at the cinema. And then they went to sleep and everything was fine. But then Julia got woken up by a random thumping sound and she heard it twice. And so she went downstairs and saw that all the lights were turned off except for the kitchen light. So she goes down to the kitchen and she sees that her mom's pendant is on the table. And her mom has a pendant of a hand. Now, her mother never really took off that pendant, so she was very confused as to why that was on the kitchen table. So she goes to go and wake up her dad, and her dad just hurriedly gets up and he runs up and he gets dressed very quickly and he runs down to the kitchen. He goes over to the kitchen sink and he turns on the water and there's this dirty water with a dirty smell that's coming out. And he's really confused as to why the fuck this is happening. And he seems to understand why the water might be like that, but he is very confused because the mother is gone. Now, he grabs a pendant back from the girl, and then that's when he is literally physically shaking as he's telling her to go back to bed. And as soon as this happens, this room gets dark because a light bulb completely turns off. Next day, she gets up really early in the morning, and she decides to sit in the living room and wait for her father to come back, because her father had left the house. But her father doesn't come back for another 24 hours, which is a bit weird and kind of not good for Child Protective Services, if you ask me specifically, but I get it. I understand it. Very weird situation to deal with. And so her father walks in, pours himself a scotch, and then sits next to Julia. And then he just says very clearly, "Your mom's not coming back. She's gone." And then this is when Julia just starts crying, because for some reason she knows that her father isn't lying, and she knows that her mom is not coming back, and she doesn't know what happened to her either. He had a padlock on the door, and then whenever Julia would ask, what are you doing in there, he would always say woodworking, though of course you would never see woodworking tools or hear anything that seemed like woodworking, so she was always a bit confused. And she could smell meat coming out of the door, but she could never open the door because the padlock was always locked. One night her father comes into the room and she pretends to lay sleeping even though she was wide awake, and he kind of just pets her face a little bit and is like, "Don't worry, I won't let him get you too." And he smelled really dirty to her, but later she would find out that was just the smell of the dirty water and blood mixed together. Over the next couple days, he kind of left a bunch of spots of blood everywhere, and she was learning how to clean these little spots of blood. She was low-key learning a little serial killer tactic, which she probably should not have been learning, but she was learning it. This is when something that Julia actually really liked started happening, which is her father would start staying at home during the day and then going to work at night, is what he told her. But actually, this is also around the time that her dad, who was working as a police officer, got laid off and ended up actually resigning from the police. He either resigned from the police or he got laid off. One of the two. Of course, Julia goes on to say that this was one of the funnest times of her life because it is when she got to go and like hang out with her dad, and she felt like she wasn't alone in the house. She can go and hang out with him, and it was actually a good time for her, which no one can fault her for because she's still a daughter of her father, whether or not she knows he's a serial killer or not, honestly. So the first time her father went into the shed during the day, Julia, who is about 10 years old at this time, so about 3 years later, she started learning how to answer the phone. So as every little girl would know, when you start answering the phones when you're younger, it's so amazing just to be able to be like, oh my god, who's calling, blah blah blah. As she called and said, oh, this is the Montauk residence, how can I help you? She heard this like really breathy German accented voice who just said, oh, can I speak to your father? And she's like, okay, well, who is this? And then he was like, oh, it's just someone from work, tell him it's just someone from work. And then she was like, okay, well then can I have a name for you? And then he says Detective Rayner. And this is the first time we hear the Rayner last name, which is very, very important that you'll learn. And as soon as she said, okay, and then she turns to her father and she says, oh, Detective Rayner is on the phone, father. The father looks completely pale at this point, and he just runs over and he grabs the phone and he's like, okay, thank you, sweetie. And then he gets the phone and he listens. As he's listening on the phone, he goes and he turns to his daughter and he's like, hey, I need you to go upstairs because we're having grown-up talk. And she's like, okay. And so as she's going up the stairs, she sees the hallway light blow out. And so she says that this happens normally now, so she knows how to completely replace them. So as she's going down to replace it, she hears her father and this guy kind of yelling back and forth at each other, but she can only hear her father's side from it. And so she heard her father on the phone, who sounded angry, saying, no, not already, do it yourself. Then at the end of the phone call, he just says, okay, all right, fine, okay. And this is when the father pours himself another cup of scotch and he goes into the shed. She takes a little break from the story and she kind of like elaborates on how the police kind of asked her like where the bodies were, like you lived with him, you should know where the bodies are, and she always said like, oh, I don't know, like she just genuinely didn't know. She just could remember the faces of a lot of the people who ended up passing away. So then this is when she realized that her dad had a lot of canisters of film laying around, so she asked her dad like, oh, why do you have these? And he's like, oh, well, I'm getting into photography, because he's a great liar. And she's like, oh, well, why don't you just get your own developing room, or red room is what you would call it. And he started smiling. He was like, okay, fine, I'll turn the guest room into a red room, but that means that you can't go in there anymore. And she agreed, and then he turned it into his red room and always had a padlock on that door too. One night, this padlock was actually unlocked and she decided to go inside to go see what was in there, which I don't blame her for. She's a curious little kid, she wants to know. And so she sees a bunch of pictures of people's faces looking very glossy, eyes open, and they all had a bunch of symbols with black ink all over them, and she couldn't tell what the symbols are, but she always remembered those glossy faces as well. And then she goes and she tells her father about it, and he stood up and hugged her and says, don't hate me, it'll all be over soon. He doesn't even seem mad that she went into the room. I guess he was expecting this to happen anyway. And then she went into the kitchen and got herself some water and went to bed, because then the air got heavy. Now here's when the real story comes in. At 2:37 a.m., Julia got thirsty. She went into the kitchen to go get water, but then some dark stuff started coming out again, and then she got really, really, really concerned. So then she decided to just go into the living room to wait for her dad, and she looked outside and she saw that the lights on the street, like the street lamps, were slowly turning off the closer and closer it got to her house. Then when the last one turned off, she heard a knocking noise on the door, and at first she didn't answer because she was like, oh no, I don't want to answer that. Then it got louder and louder until it just felt like it was just meat that was slamming up against the door, basically. And so her being scared, she starts to run towards the back of the house to kind of phone the police. So she calls the police and she tells them everything. But then as she's calling the police, she hears another thump and the door breaks. Here's a growl, and so that's when she decides to run straight into her father's shed that was actually not locked this time. And she sees her dad standing in this blue light, completely bathed in the blue light as he's chanting. and there's a man dead on the table with his chest completely cut open, and he has a heart in one hand and a knife in the other one. Now, to give you a little bit more of a layout of what the shed looks like, on all of the walls there is a bunch of shelves that has a bunch of jars of hearts with liquid inside of them, and as he started chanting, those hearts started beating, even the ones on the walls. The guy also had the pendant that her mom had on. He had that one on as well, and as he brought the chanting into a stop, he stabbed the heart, and then that's when everything fell silent. He then looked at the daughter, apologized, and then ran. And then that's when she describes it as, you know the rest of the story. It's a manhunt, trial, prison, death. In total, he had 40 hearts, 41 including the new one in his hand. Now we get to the important notes part. So, Jonathan says an enthusiast of the serial killer community helped him to go through to do a thorough outlook of the police reports, because I cannot speak today. And then they learn that there is a body of Christopher Lawn there. The rest of the bodies were not found. But then they learn that the pendant originated from the People's Church of Divine Hosts. And that's a small cult, apparently. And so then that's when they learn that there's another case number, the case of Maxwell Rayner in the late 80s to early 90s. And that case number is 011069222. Rayner apparently disappeared in 1994. He used to have the house that was on York Street. The shed is now gone from the original house. And November 1st of 2002, the father who was in jail was stabbed 47 times in jail. But there was no weapons found at the scene that were connected to the killing. And at the time of death, the light bulb blew out and it was completely dark. Thank you guys for joining me for this episode. I know it was a kind of a longer episode. It was actually our first 3-pager. So hopefully you guys liked the storyline, because I know that I did. Welcome to episode number 10. The one that has so many memes about it because it is called the Vampire Killer episode. And the date of this episode is July 10th of 2010, Trevor Herbert. Let's get started as to saying why Trevor Herbert is so popular. Trevor Herbert is a self-proclaimed vampire killer, but to start you off at the very, very beginning, he actually started off as homeless for most of his life. At a point in time, he was known as Trevor the Tramp in Manchester, and he became very famous because of the fact that he could guess people's ages, and most often, he got them correct, which honestly, props to you. If TikTok was a thing back then, you'd be on TikTok. So then he actually said that he included vampire teeth with his statement, and he killed 5 people for being vampires, 1 being a human, but he said that the human one was okay because he was apparently a violent criminal. So first vampire in 1959. This was also around the time that Trevor and his brother were homeless because they ran away from their very abusive father, who actually, he ended up killing the mother, so the children ran away from him because of that. But they were sitting on the street kind of like asking around for money. That's when Sylvia McDonald comes into the picture. And Sylvia McDonald is a widowed old woman, and she commanded them. She didn't say a single word, but she kind of said through telepathy, told them that she was going to take them in, essentially. And apparently, he said that he should have known this back then, but he didn't really know killers back then, that apparently she had a lot of vamp mannerisms. These vamp mannerisms that he does explain is that they're more animal than human, that they don't speak, they make known clear what they want through clarity, and they can move around during the day, because a lot of people don't know that. So they commanded her to come to the house with them. As soon as they opened the door to the house, they smelled this really old smell, which Trevor apparently said was a smell of old blood. And apparently there was only lines in the dust in where she moved, so she might have had the same schedule of moving around the same ways, because those were the only paths that were actually clear from all of the dust on the ground, which, good on you for figuring out like little environmental things before you go into a place that you were commanded to go into. Commanded them to understand which room was which, and so that way they knew that they had their own rooms right next to each other, which they weren't too upset about. she commanded them to pick out some fruit from the very old fruit bowl that she had, and so they picked out the ones that looked the most edible, of course, and so they both had some. The windows were boarded, the front door was locked. Nigel is the little brother's name, so you have Trevor and Nigel. As the old lady kind of went away, that's when they kind of realized that this is not a good situation that they should be in, because the clarity was starting to wear off, / telepathy, whatever you want to call it. And so they made the executive decision that they were going to leave. This is happening as Trevor is going into Nigel's room, and Nigel's like, I don't feel comfortable here. Trevor agrees, but then they hear the woman coming back in. So Trevor hurriedly goes under the bed to quickly hide away, and then that's when the woman goes straight over to the bed where Nigel's pretend sleeping, and she just completely comes over. The mouth opens really wide with a bunch of sharp teeth, and she just grabs a chunk of his neck, and she pulls out the big chunk of his neck, and this long tongue comes out, and she starts looking up all the blood that's inside of there. It's really, really gruesome how detailed they get. Trevor, of course, heard Nigel going through the struggle as he was laying up under the bed. I kind of felt like maybe he should have helped, but I, of course, understand that he wouldn't really know how to help out. So he was hearing these slurping noises from the vampire, and Nigel actually dropped something on the floor because he had just passed away, unfortunately, and it was actually looking like a knife, like a pocket knife that he had actually held on to for so long. So as the vampire finishes their meal, they kind of lay out on the ground. Their stomach is really big and bulging, and it's kind of like they're taking a little nap because they got into a food coma, which is understandable. And so as they're sitting in this food coma, Trev gets up and stabs the creature right in the stomach, and a bunch of blood starts to pour out. And so, of course, this creature is flailing, doesn't know what to do, is very confused, tries to say and scream, but can't because they don't talk. So Nigel's actually also holding onto a candle, which he's actually burning his hand on, and he throws the candle on top of the vampire, and the vampire so quickly sets on fire because apparently the vampires get very dry after a certain period of time within this world. And as the fire was covering the vamp's body, Trevor remembers that the key is actually inside of the vampire's handbag, so he goes into the bedroom of the vampire, and he also realizes that's where it seems to take a lot of its meals, because there was a lot of skeletons in there, which he found very creepy. He found the key and he ran outside. He wanted to go back in for Nigel, but he knew that he was dead already and there was nothing that he could do. Of course, about a decade later after this, and around 1968 is his second victim. And so, of course, he's still homeless and he's begging people for money. And so this one guy, you'll later learn his name is Robert. He ends up, his name is Robert Arden for full context of names, because sometimes that is important. He ends up asking him for money too, and he commands him to understand that he will not be giving any money to him. And as he continues to walk away, Trevor starts to realize that he never opened his mouth. So he gets up and he follows behind him as Robert is paired with a very drunk woman. And he grabs a random wooden stake or something, and he starts to sharpen it with the pocket knife that he kept that was Nigel's. And as he's following behind this couple, he sharpens it and he gets ready to help this woman if the woman needed it. That's when they arrive to Robert's house, and Robert leads her inside. Trevor, of course, is checking every single window to see which one is open, and he finds one that is open. He has her sit on the couch. She sits on the couch, and Robert goes around the couch and goes around to her neck and is about to bite her. But then that's when Trevor comes in like a superhero, and he grabs him and he pushes him away. And then that's when Trevor realizes, oh shit, because the vampire turns and pounces on him through the window again. And then that's when he's struggling with the vampire a little bit. The vampire actually ends up biting him, but not taking a chunk of meat out of him. He bites him, starts flailing, and then actually turns over onto his back. As it's flailing, the drunk woman realizes, oh shit, what the fuck is that? And she grabs a kitchen knife and starts stabbing it repeatedly. As the vampire is spazzing in the story, Trevor stops to tell us that he actually is a off and on heroin addict. So of course he tells us a little bit about that too, which is very interesting, because I don't know how a homeless person would get the money or the fines to get heroin. But that's when the woman stopped stabbing it and she dropped the knife and ran away, which understandable. Honestly, as a drunk woman, you do that instead of throwing up. I'm shocked. So then that's when Trev went over and stabbed it with the wooden stake through the heart. And then the entire body turns into ash and the thing is gone. Trevor ends the statement by telling us that apparently vampires are very rare sightings and that it eats very infrequently and doesn't eat solid food. But he doesn't tell us about the other 3 victims, especially the human. I'm like, I want to hear about that one too. But here's a few important notes for this episode. So, we find out that Martin was there at the time that this was given, and that Trevor said that he needed to take a minute to sleep. So he went into the break room to try to get some sleep, and he didn't wake up and end up actually passing away. And then a police report confirms Robert Arden's missing, and they think there's some foul play involved because of the broken window and the little patch of like fire. It just doesn't seem right to him. Another news report that did state that there was a house fire during the time that Nigel passed away, and that's how they clarified Nigel's passing, which was really unfortunate because he did die at the age of 18. This is when they actually briefly also touch on Allard Dupont, and I guess he's going to come up again because they don't really touch on very much of him. They just say his name and maybe a couple of words afterward. And then they say that they got a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy of the bag of teeth, and that the teeth were already tested, and they don't match any species on record. But he doesn't have the bag of the teeth because apparently the government has the bag now and wants to look more into it.
Rusty Quill presents